All right, guys, welcome in. I'm Nathan Erbach, your host of the Notre Dame postgame show on Mark Rogers TV at the Voice of College Football. I'm here with my co-host as usual, Ben Belden. Has been, I think, we were absent the last couple weeks, but here and ready to go. Talk a little Notre Dame postgame against Navy. Obviously, 34-6 win for Notre Dame. A couple teams in front of Notre Dame today lost. Which should mean that they move up a few spots in the college football rankings or playoff committee rankings. I don't know if that means much for Notre Dame this year. Me and Ben will kind of talk about that a little bit, but certainly every loss in front matters. With Michigan State going down, specifically Wake Forest, who was one spot ahead of Notre Dame, also lost. And then I think Cincinnati played an iffy game against Tulsa, and that's probably the second or third iffy game that they've had here in the last several weeks. So who knows? But that's obviously a common opponent for Notre Dame, with their one loss being to Cincinnati, which I think is becoming a little bit more aggravating as the weeks go on. And it's, as Notre Dame fans and analysts, I think we certainly feel like if Notre Dame would have won that game, they'd be positioned pretty well moving forward. So, but again, Ben, thanks for coming on today with me again, and let's talk a little bit of Notre Dame Navy.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be back on. You know, people continually are not consulting me in plans in terms of they just expect me to be certain places while Notre Dame's on and things. So it's good to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little. I mean, obviously, kind of an ugly start for Notre Dame, something that was sort of reminiscent of some of their early games during the season against, Florida State, Toledo, pretty much every time until the last couple of weeks, starting against UNC, North Carolina. They looked a lot better offensively with their tempo out of the bye week. And, today was another slow start. I think the first three series or so didn't end in points. Navy actually had a 3-0 lead, I think, going into the second quarter, if I'm not mistaken, or right into the second quarter or right before it. But once Notre Dame was able to punch it in for their first score, it was kind of just all Notre Dame from there. And, obviously you can see from the score, if you didn't watch the game, it ended up in a 34-6 thrashing of sorts in the second half. It was pretty much a complete domination. I think Navy started out with the ball and took a big chunk of time off the clock. I mean, I think Notre Dame got the ball back with like 5 minutes left in the third quarter, but from there on out, it was pretty much, Notre Dame, I think 17-6, the remaining part of the game, or 17-3, which I think was actually the halftime score, ironically enough. So it was 17-3 in both halves. And you'll take that. I mean, I know Cincinnati struggled with Navy a little bit. Navy's not the team that they typically are. I mean, they're 2-7, but they're still gonna play hard every week, and they're an opponent you got to respect just with the way that they control tempo on offense specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at Drew Brees, Mike Tirico, even Brian Kelly, really, if you listen to him on the broadcast, hit the nail on the head that, the thing about Navy is that, the triple option is hard in and of itself, but then it's also hard when you factor in that, like, 2 or 3 teams in college football do it. So, I mean, you're only going to see it once a year at most if you're Notre Dame, and most teams don't even see it once a year. So Navy can I don't know, can sneak up on some people. Obviously, it took Notre Dame a little bit of time to adjust, like you said. Defensively, though, I mean, I think that's as good as you can do against Navy, in my opinion. And obviously, the broadcast made a point to say that Marcus Freeman has coached against Navy. I mean, they play in the American Conference, and he's coached against Navy every year, while he was at Cincinnati. So that probably had something to do with it. Got to be happy with that. And like you said, I think that Navy was a I lost my train of thought. Navy, snuck up on Notre Dame in terms of, the offense couldn't get going. That's the main concern, I guess, is the slow start in terms of, that's the concerning thing here, is that Notre Dame has gotten off to these slow starts. You didn't want to see it against Navy. Usually when you're talking about going 3 and out twice to start the game on offense against Navy, like, that's a real bad recipe for a game against a team like Navy that controls the clock the way they do. Notre Dame got away with it because they played pretty good defense today.
Yeah, it's funny. I mentioned that on my podcast earlier this week. I mean, by the way, obviously, I mean you guys know if you follow us on a weekly basis, but my podcast is the Golden Homers podcast along with Mason Plummer. Ben has his own podcast, the Under the Dome podcast, that he puts out on a weekly basis, pretty much as well. One of my big things with that, or one of my main points of our podcast this week is that I thought that the Notre Dame defense would look well, are pretty good against Navy, and I thought it was actually coming at a good time with them being relatively tired. The linebacking core continues to be banged up. I mean, I think Drew White and J.D. Bertrand aren't playing at a 100%. I think it just came out today that Drew White's playing on essentially a torn PCL or close to it. And, obviously they're down 3 linebackers for the season already. So, having Navy, which can be a concern with the way that they block and different things like that on offense, and you don't want to get injured. At the same time, I thought it was a very, I thought it was a good opponent for the Notre Dame linebackers to kind of do what they do best, and that's attack downhill. They don't necessarily have to go sideline to sideline super, super well and compete with a bunch of athletes. And I think that played in Notre Dame's hands. So holding Navy to 6 points or no touchdowns, whatever, didn't necessarily surprise me. I think my prediction was 44-14 or something like that. I thought Navy would score 1 in the first half and maybe like 1 garbage time touchdown in the second half. And in reality, that's kind of what they did. I mean, Navy drove down the field a few times, but Notre Dame was able to hold in the red zone. And pretty much every time Notre Dame got the ball after their slow start, they moved down the field and put up points on the board.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with really anything that you said there. I think, one thing that you were kind of alluding to a little bit, but didn't specifically mention was, getting Jack Kaiser on the field a little bit. Initially I sort of thought, well, not having Kyle Hamilton for this game and his tackling abilities and his, kind of ranginess to clean up some things I thought might sort of hurt Notre Dame to a certain degree. Although I guess you would say probably for the most part, Kyle Hamilton makes most of his impact in the passing game. I just still sort of thought this would be a nice game for Kyle Hamilton to if we're talking about this 3-4 weeks ago before the injury, you would want Kyle Hamilton for this one. But, the moving of Jack Kaiser to safety was, for this particular game, was interesting, I guess you could say. I mean, not something I could say that I expected, but makes sense. I mean, I don't know what they ended up completing. Navy ended up completing maybe 1 pass. I mean, I know the broadcast was making a big deal about it, that it was into the 3rd or 4th quarter and they still hadn't completed a pass. So, and great job up front by, I always say that I love watching Jason Adamilola. Another time, check that box for me if you're playing Notre Dame bingo. I don't know. The guys up front did a great stuff. Navy helped him out a little bit, I think, early, don't you think? By one of those first drives, they called two pass plays. Notre Dame sacked him twice in a row, and really kind of that was, if you're a Navy fan, that's a little bit of a head scratcher. But I don't know. It was a I don't know. There's going to be Notre Dame fans that gripe about this game, as always, and some of those gripes are certainly valid. But at the end of the day, you went ahead and just won handily against a team you should handle handily. I don't know.
Yeah, no, and going back to your Kyle Hamilton comment, I mean, I'm sure he would have had a few tackles for loss in there just because he's a terrific athlete and would have been the best athlete on the field. But I think they compromised with that a little bit with Xavier Watts got some time for the first time this year on defense, and I think me and you both feel like he's just a terrific athlete and someone that could end up being a starting safety for them maybe next year. Came in obviously as a wide receiver recruit, but a kid that was also recruited as a safety corner, maybe even a rover linebacker to some other programs. And I know Notre Dame liked him on that side of the ball as well. Saw Prince Colley, who was the Buckus Award winner at the high school ranks last year, maybe a little raw to be a Notre Dame starter at linebacker right now with some of the guys they have in place. But at the same time, I mean, sometimes against a team like Navy, even though you have to be, you have to have your gap assignment and be assignment sound. sometimes overall athleticism can play a role. And I think you saw that on a couple occasions with Cauley and Watts specifically. They were able to just beat guys to the outside and not let them turn the corner and gain, 8 to 10 yards, but instead kept them to, maybe for a loss or little to no gain at that. So I thought that was interesting. And Notre Dame always seems to have a little bit of a wrinkle against Navy. I mean, I know Greer Martini a few years back was kind of like the Navy killer. Drew White came in a few years ago before he was a prominent player at linebacker and a starter, and played really well against them. Kaiser is really well suited for that sort of role as well, because he does have a lot of athleticism. So it's the team Navy where he can play a little bit back and play, sort of have that downfield attacking role at the safety position. I think that suits him well as too. And then, I already mentioned Watts and Cauley. So Notre Dame's always able to kind of dial up these random defensive assignments against Navy, and it works out in their favor because they have the athletes to do it. And they've played Navy so many times. And Kelly's been the coach there, now for 12 plus years, that he knows what he's doing when he's playing a team like Navy. And it's fun to watch sometimes with some of these other guys getting in on the action.
Yeah. I mean, just to echo what you're saying, you mentioned it. I mean, how many guys for Notre Dame defense did you hear their name called this particular game? I mean, Jordan Botelho made a couple nice plays. You mentioned a whole host of guys.
Got in the game, I think, too.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, and that's what you need against Navy, is to have some depth, because, I mean, Navy doesn't pass the ball. So if you're a linebacker, defensive lineman, even your defensive backs, you're getting hit on every play. I mean, there's something to be said by that. So there's no play where, you drop back. If you're a linebacker, you drop back into coverage and then it's an incomplete pass and you didn't have to hit somebody. So, I mean,
right.
There's something to be said about that playing against Navy. And so, it was kind of fun in that regard to see some of Notre Dame's depth. Interesting with how well Notre Dame did in the red zone, I think, as well. I mean, I don't think, when you play against a team like Navy, you'd expect them to be a really good red zone team because of what they do. Notre Dame really, I don't know if you can call it bend but don't break. I mean, it's weird to say that when you played against Navy, but that's what it was like. They really stifled them in the red zone, and I think, there's a lot to be said about that.
Well, and in reality, too, I mean, outside of that one really long run towards the beginning of the game, I think, where they kind of did the double reverse or whatever it was, Navy was sort of just picking up 2-3 yards at a time. They had a few plays here and there. They were able to pick up chunk yards. So not only really just in the red zone, but in general, I mean, this felt like – and Notre Dame has been trending this way towards Navy over the last, 4 or 5 times they've played with their with Mike Elko, Clark Lee, and now Marcus Freeman being the defensive coordinators. And Notre Dame just kind of at a different level as a program overall. They, you just don't really get worried about Navy anymore, and that's a good thing to say, because part of those times where we have been scared with Navy is Navy's been a good program. They've been down the last couple of years, but overall, I mean, there's been times where Notre Dame pounces Navy, 48-0, and Navy goes on to have a 10-2 season. So it's nice to see where Notre Dame's at. I do like when Navy's good overall. I mean, obviously being a service academy and so on and so forth, it's good when they're a top 25 team or close to that. And obviously it certainly helps Notre Dame's schedule as well. I kind of wanted to touch on the offense a little bit. I know we mentioned the slow start. Did you find it interesting at all that, and I was actually watching this with a good friend of mine, and we were talking about, over the last couple of weeks, Buckner had been getting a lot more play on first series, second series, whatever, depending on whether it was down and distance, third and short, whatever, red zone, backed up in your own territory, whatever. They had these like kind of special roles for him. And today it was sort of the Jack Cohn show for almost the entire first half, until they decided to go with Buckner for one drive. And then they, of course, go ahead and put it in the end zone. And then from there on out, he got more play. Cohn obviously started playing better after that, certainly. And the offense just flowed. But I don't know, I just found it interesting that, especially against a team like Navy, where you feel like athleticism would sort of be the key. And Navy wouldn't be able to account for, Buckner's running ability, his passing ability, along with Kyron Williams, Logan Diggs, Chris Tyree, running the football. I thought it was interesting that they waited so long to go to Buckner. And then when they did, of course, it worked out.
Right. Yeah. I think, you hit the nail on the head. I think there were, a few people on Twitter kind of saying the same thing. When you see Jack Cohn back there and Navy's dropping 8 into pass coverage, which is obviously, that's good strategy against Jack Cohn. I mean, what's he going to do? Run for 2 yards? I mean, I know he had the 21.
Not last week, Ben. Not last week.
I know. I did actually. I know I wasn't on the show with you, but I did actually end up watching that game, not 100% live, but regardless, I mean, you would live with Jack Cohn running for 5 or 6 yards once in a while, in those types of situations. So, I mean, that was a good strategy. And I'm like, well, just put Tyler Buckner in and run a QB draw, or they don't drop 8. They know that Tyler Buckner's in, and now you can at least throw the ball because, I know you've talked to Robbie Toma a couple weeks back on your podcast, and I follow him on Twitter. He's a good guy to follow during Notre Dame games because he kind of puts it in a nice player's perspective, in a very real puts it into he says all the time about how the casual fan doesn't understand this and that. And he's right. He's absolutely right. He said, I'd like to see a lot of you couch quarterbacks throw into 8 men in coverage. And yeah, exactly. So I don't know if Notre Dame fans are killing Jack Cohn for not doing that. I mean, that's not the right. I mean, you can call for Tyler Buckner in that situation because maybe that plays into his strength a little bit. But you can't get all over Jack Cohn because he's not throwing into 8 defensive backs, essentially, and linebackers in coverage. So I don't know. Yeah, I really thought that Buckner would get the call a little bit earlier just to kind of, I don't know, make that defense do something different, I guess. And I overall, I don't know what they're doing with Buckner to a certain degree. Played so well against Virginia Tech, and I know that Cohn brought him back and that type of stuff. I thought we would start to see a little bit higher percentage of snaps for Buckner. I don't know. I don't know. That situation is not one that I completely understand yet.
Yeah, and that was really what my point was, overall. And, I know you weren't disagreeing, but just to kind of further emphasize that, it really wasn't anything that Cohn did wrong. I mean, overall, today he was 23 of 29. He had a touchdown, didn't turn the ball over, had, almost 270 yards passing. It was really just those first 3 drives. You felt like Navy was just not respecting the fact that Cohn could do things with his legs. And to a certain extent, that's completely fair. When you drop 8, and you have a pass rush that got to him a few times here and there, when you can guard the receivers for, 4 or 5 seconds, and then he kind of gets antsy in the pocket. Why wouldn't you go with Buckner, bring in 2 more guys in the box that have to account for him? And then not only can Buckner pull it and run, he can keep the ball. And Kyron Williams is maybe the best running back in college football. And then not only that, but Buckner has shown over the last several weeks that he's continuing to prove as a passer. He can on the RPOs, he can throw or run, which he's shown a few times. And then he has a cannon. I mean, he's hit Austin deep on 50-yard go routes, and so on and so forth. So going to your point, it really was more of like a interesting coaching decision, at least from my standpoint, versus Cohn playing poorly. Because I also thought a few of those sacks, and I've been pretty critical of Cohn throughout the year in regards to some of the sacks being on him. I didn't really feel like some of the sacks were on him today. I think there was one on 4th down specifically where it was a blitz and the guy was in his face right away. So it's like, what do you want him to do? He's either throwing that away, trying to make something happen that he shouldn't and throws a pick or so on and so forth, or he takes the sack and Notre Dame punts or Navy gets the ball back, and then you hope for the best from there, and then you get the ball back after that. And ironically enough, I think it was Buckner that came in right after that drive, and that's when they had their first touchdown. And I think that's when the staff finally realized, hey, we need to mix this up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Buckner seems to be the spark. I don't like feeling like I'm insinuating that Tyler Buckner needs to start. But how many times, I guess, are we going to see? Because, like you said, it's not Jack Cohn's fault. Like I got to continue to make that disclaimer, but it just sort of seems like how many times are we going to start slow with Jack Cohn, have Tyler Buckner come in, spark the offense, score, and then we're okay. Maybe just do that on the first drive of the game is kind of my thought. I mean, it doesn't mean that Jack Cohn can't play, because I do think that Jack Cohn, has an element to him that helps this offense, especially if they're going with, a little bit more of the hurry up, which they didn't really do a ton of today, which also perplexed me. I sort of thought get Navy on their heels a little bit, and could Navy even handle that? I sort of thought not, and we didn't really sort of see that. So if we're talking about coaching decisions, that's another one that I don't fully get. I guess I don't have to fully get. I mean, I get to talk about it, that I don't get it, and it makes hopefully for good listening. But I don't know. Like, I am perplexed about a lot of things, but at the end of the day, at least I'm perplexed after 34-6 instead of some other alternative, something that could have been a lot worse.
You stole my word. I was going to say that was the perplexing thing about the whole thing today was I think it was the tempo. I mean, the last two games, they've been terrific on offense overall, no matter who had been there. And ironically enough, I think that they had actually found a good role for Buckner. He didn't have to be the starter, but you go tempo, and Buckner completes, 3 or 4 passes in a row, and all of a sudden you're on the 30-yard line. You bring in Buckner, defense is gassed, and you RPO him to death, and then boom, you're in the end zone for a touchdown. And I thought that was a really interesting way to use both quarterbacks. And today it felt like, okay, today it's going to be Buckner's drive or it's going to be Cohn's drive, which, you can get away with against Navy, and maybe they were trying to try a few different things out and, give Buckner more time as being like the main guy for a series here or two, and keep Cohn in on situations that they maybe sometimes bring Buckner in, and so on and so forth. Again, like you said, we're not the coaches. We just get to talk about it. And, I don't even think that we'll ever really hear that from the coaches, because they're not going to give away their game plan and so on and so forth. But I'd be surprised if next week against Virginia, especially if Armstrong is healthy and ready to go, they're a high-powered offense. I'd be pretty surprised if Notre Dame doesn't go back to their tempo offense and do exactly what I said. You go tempo. Cohn's able to complete passes, quick routes, get the ball out quick in general, and lead the team down the field. And then like I said, you bring in Buckner, whether it's short yardage, 3rd and 1, 4th and 1, whatever it is, or you're in the red zone and you want to run something different that maybe Cohn can't provide. And that's really going to be a terror to the defense that's not necessarily prepared for it in that specific down and distance or whatever it may be. So that's kind of what I want to believe, is that maybe the coaching staff, not the players, were like, okay, this is a game that we're going to win, and we're going to try a few things out and maybe get guys prepared for different types of situations down the road.
Well, yeah, that's been Brian Kelly's. I don't know. I mean, they've done that in 12 years under Brian Kelly. They don't necessarily wait until they're blowing a team out to try a couple things, because they want to see it in a real live game situation where the other team has obviously schemed for them and done that type of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think there is a little bit of that goes on, and it drives Notre Dame fans crazy. It drives me crazy to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, I know that recently it just seems like every day there's people especially when rankings and things come out, how good is Notre Dame, all of this type of stuff. They want to talk about how good Notre Dame is or isn't. I think it says something to how good they are that they're willing to kind of come out and be like, okay, like, we're going to give this a shot because we think at the end of the day, we're just going to, we're going to win anyway. And they've done that a lot, and they've pretty much generally gotten away. It's not like they're going out, when they play against Georgia or whoever, Clemson, whoever the big names that they've played over the last few years, and trying out new stuff. But, I do think that, this is, and they've said it a million times, transitional year. How many times have you heard that term? Mm-hmm. And, they're finding what works with and who it works for, because they can win these games and do that. You'd like for it to look a little bit better, I guess. And, we could talk about that round and round for hours and hours, but we won't.
Yeah, absolutely. We won't go too long today. Obviously, I know a lot of people aren't probably tuning into Navy Notre Dame post game when there's some other other games going on and so on and so forth. But we do appreciate your comments and your questions. I wanted to, before I get to some of those that came on that came early on, and there may be some general terms. I know there was one about Cincinnati and then one about Ohio State, where maybe where Notre Dame can end up being in the college football playoff down the line. I want to touch on a few stats today. I mean, I know Kevin Austin Jr. Probably had his best game in a Notre Dame uniform, at least statistically speaking. Went 6 for 139 and a touchdown. I think that was his most yards. He had a really nice catch down the sideline. I forget who was that. Buckner who threw that ball. No, it was Cone. No, it was Cone. Yeah, because Buckner only had like a 12-yard completion or something like that. But he had a really nice like shoestring almost catch. Or caught it with his fingertips, if you want to say, and that led to a touchdown. Had another one that was almost a touchdown from Buckner, which was that 12-yarder, and then of course he had the touchdown as well later on in the game. So he had a really nice game. Can't speak highly enough about Kyren Williams. The guy just brings it every week. I think I'll forever have that one. I think it was against North Carolina after the 91-yard run, after he had injured his knee and everybody thought he was done for the year. And Brian Kelly comes and talks to him and he goes, "Are you good?" And he goes, "Coach, I'm always good," or whatever he says. And it was, I think I'll forever have that highlight in my head when it comes to him. And it's just really the way he plays the game, and he epitomizes what you want to see in almost every guy that steps on a football field for your favorite football team. And of course, today he goes out and, averages 5.6 yards a carry, continuing to, raise his stock in the NFL draft. But also, after a slow start to the season, mostly because of the offensive line, at least statistically speaking, he's now over 5 yards a carry on the year. I think he has like 12 or 13 touchdowns on the season as well. And, if Notre Dame was undefeated, we might be talking about him as a Heisman candidate with no one really running away from it. I think he's certainly pretty much on par with Kenneth Walker this year overall, if you add his receiving statistics in there. So kudos to him. And then Logan Diggs looks like another, the next in line to just be a really, really good running back for Notre Dame. His touchdown run specifically was tremendous. Like I said, he looks like maybe the next really, really great Notre Dame running back. So just highlighting a few guys on the offensive side of the ball for those reasons.
Yeah. How about Golden Tate talking about Kyren Williams? I don't know if you caught this comment or not. He said, he's like, "This might be the best number 23 that Notre Dame's ever seen."
We're talking about that.
Right. I sort of was, it took me a second. I'm like, wait a minute. Oh, Golden Tate. You haven't seen Golden Tate in a 23 jersey for a long time. It's like, oh. So I wonder how many Notre Dame fans, I believe that was during halftime is when that comment was made. So I wonder how many Notre Dame fans actually caught that. But yeah, high praise for sure. Yeah, Kyren Williams, I mean, he's going to be one of my best, or one of my, most loved Notre Dame players. When I'm sitting talking about Notre Dame in 20 years, I'm going to be talking about Kyren Williams, I'm pretty sure.
And ironically enough, or weirdly enough, I would say, even though Golden Tate was a receiver, he was sort of recruited as a running back / receiver early on. I don't know if you knew that, like in the Charlie Weiss era, but people didn't know what he would exactly play. And, he did do some of the reverse game and stuff like that during his time at Notre Dame, but they kind of look very similar. I mean, they're sort of built similarly, and they, I don't know if Golden Tate had the dog mentality in him that Kyren does, but he certainly had that dog mentality, and I think he carried that into the NFL maybe more than he did when he was at Notre Dame. Probably mostly because he was just blowing by people when he was at Notre Dame, and he would catch those Jimmy Clausen 50-yard touchdowns where no one was even near him. And Kyren Williams has to work for his a little bit more, so you see more stiff arms and broken tackles and stuff like that, partly because of the position he plays. But he really does. I mean, it's I've never really thought about that comparison until you just brought it up, and obviously – I don't think that's what he was meaning with this comparison in general either. But like I said, now you kind of watch him on the field, and there's some Golden Tate to Williams's game for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and they're both just such well-rounded players that just do whatever Notre Dame asked of them to do. Whether it was for Golden Tate, catch one deep, catch one over the middle, catch a screen pass, take it, get a reverse. I mean, for Kyren Williams, it's pass block, probably not run block so much, but catch a pass and shake a couple dudes. Get all of these yards after first contact, all of that stuff. I mean, they're both those kind of Swiss Army knife type of players, I guess, and that's kind of another, I guess, layer to the comparison.
I would argue he does run block just for himself with his stiff arms and broken tackles and stuff. It's kind of like run blocking for himself, weird way of putting it. But I want to get, like I said, I do appreciate the comments from you guys. I want to get to a few that hopefully you guys are still listening. That put these out earlier. The first one was Ohio State's offensive effort today won't be enough versus Purdue. And I think that brings up an interesting point. I mean, it's now the second week in a row that Ohio State's looked kind of iffy against a mediocre football team. I know Penn State's, well regarded, but they do have 3 losses now. And, today against Nebraska, who I think is probably a little bit better than their record shows because they've been competitive in a lot of their football games this year. Had Ohio State on the ropes in the fourth quarter and had a chance to win that football game if they didn't, I think did more damage to themselves overall. But, it's interesting. If Ohio State would have lost today, Notre Dame probably would have jumped in with 1 loss versus 2. But you got to start thinking is, maybe Notre Dame deserves to be kind of in that Michigan to Ohio State territory as a football team now that they're kind of playing their best ball. I know in years past when Ohio State, or a couple years ago, I know when Michigan lost to Notre Dame to begin the season, at the end of the year, there was a lot of talk that Michigan was the better football team because of the way they were playing. And Notre Dame was maybe scraping by a few teams or didn't have the resume maybe that Michigan had. But then, of course, Michigan loses to Ohio State, and then it was neither here or there when it came down to that. But almost in the reverse, you can almost argue that Notre Dame has looked like the better football team over the last several weeks comparatively to some of these teams that are ahead of them. Obviously today with Michigan State and Cincinnati losing, Notre Dame's going to jump them, of course, I would assume. Maybe not Michigan State, but Michigan State did lose to kind of like, again, another, good but mediocre team in general in Purdue, who's lost to some good teams, but also beat some good teams. And then Wake Forest, obviously, with only being 1 spot ahead of Notre Dame, kind of disrespected already with their record as it was. I think Notre Dame jumps them fairly easily. But it's an interesting conversation, I think, with Ohio State and maybe not Oklahoma until they lose. But I'm starting to get into this. I mean, I think Notre Dame goes 11-1 to end the season, which is going to put them in not the driver's seat to make the college football playoff. I would not bet on them making the college football playoff because I still think a lot of things have to go their way for that to happen. But it's things are starting to happen where it feels like there might be this like sliver of possibility that they could somehow sneak in.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic because, I was thinking about this too. It seems like every other year, I can think of a couple years at least where Notre Dame was sitting there with like a 1 loss and you're kind of thinking about the scenarios and you're thinking like, man, I hope Notre Dame, like this happens and this happens and this happens and Notre Dame gets in. This year they looked bad and then they lost to Cincinnati and you start thinking like, oh, Notre Dame's, you don't even think that the college football playoff is a possibility or something you want. But now here we are again, now it's early November and it's looking like there are a couple things. I mean, there would need to be a little bit of chaos for it to happen, but chaos always seems to happen. It feels like, so I don't know. It will be interesting to see, I think I sort of disagree with you that I think the Michigan State's still going to stay ahead of Notre Dame.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Because and it doesn't make a ton of sense. Notre Dame beat Purdue, and Notre Dame's 1 loss is against another team that's in the top 10. And Michigan State can't say the same. They lost to Purdue, and their loss obviously came against someone that's not in the top 10. So, but the precedence is, until, and I know this wasn't a college football playoff ranking, but people had Iowa ranked ahead of Notre Dame after losing to Purdue. So I don't know. We'll sort of see. Like I say, I know the college football playoff's a different thing than the AP poll, but most of the time, it seems to mirror it pretty closely with obvious exceptions, I guess. I don't know. And Cincinnati continues, we talked about the word perplexed earlier. They perplex me. I don't know if you caught any of their game, but man, after beating Notre Dame, they just haven't looked good. And I wonder how badly that hurts Notre Dame. because since Cincinnati hasn't looked real great and only got, even though they're undefeated, to the 6th seed, how badly that loss looks on Notre Dame, because Cincinnati is not, they're on the outside looking in right now. So I don't know. That's Cincinnati should have lost today. Let's just put it that way. I mean, I caught bits and pieces of that game in between the Notre Dame game and stuff, but they should have lost to Tulsa. So I don't know.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So it'll be interesting as we speak right now. I've got LSU Alabama, which usually is like a big game. Obviously doesn't have the same build up this year for, since LSU is not very, very good, but they're almost to the end of the first quarter and LSU looks pretty good against Alabama and is up a touchdown. And Alabama just looks bad right now. So it'll be interesting to see, as chaos unfolds over the last 2-3 weeks of this college football playoff, or I'm sorry, the season, how the college football playoff ends up shaking itself out. I got to be honest, I would not be looking forward to a game against Georgia in the college football playoff if that's what was going on. But at the end of the day, I don't know. I love the chaos. You might as well, if you're gonna play a game in early January, maybe it might as well be against Georgia and give yourself a chance to win a national. I mean, you're not going to turn down a chance, I guess, is the best way that I can put it.
Yeah, and it really is interesting. Like I said, I would not predict Notre Dame making the college football playoff, even if they went out. Like, I think there's still a lot of things that have to kind of play in their favor for it to happen. And like you mentioned, I mean, this isn't the team that I would expect to necessarily go out and win in the college football playoff either. But it would be interesting that this is sort of Notre Dame's worst team over the last couple of years, at least from like just watching it and the feeling of it standpoint. If they went out and did win a college football playoff game somehow. And maybe there's an argument to be made that this is one of the worst field crops in recent memory too. So, I know Georgia's very dominant on defense, but the fact that they're not this like overwhelmingly dominant offense, I think plays in Notre Dame's favor to where maybe it could be a low scoring game. Maybe there's a interception, Stenson, the quarterback at Georgia, has been prone to commit some turnovers here and there. If Hamilton's playing specifically, then I think Notre Dame could maybe match up well against Georgia's offense. And then, Alabama does certainly seem to have a little bit of a flawed team, obviously losing to a backup quarterback against Texas A&M. Resume, at least in our eyes, not necessarily the college football playoff committee's eyes. But if they were to lose to LSU, I think that would pretty much eliminate them completely from the college football playoff talk for the rest of the season. And then there's a lot of talk about Cincinnati for Notre Dame, that Cincinnati has to win out and for it to help Notre Dame. I mean, I think there's arguments to be made there if everything else goes in both teams' favor, and they both end up sneaking into the playoff. But I think Notre Dame would jump a one-loss Cincinnati at this point. And it goes to my point about Notre Dame playing right now. I think the college football committee probably assumes that Notre Dame's a better football team than them, and that's why they didn't give Cincinnati the respect they deserved as a undefeated team. And if they were to play again, I think most people would feel Notre Dame's the favorite. So if Cincinnati were to lose, I actually think that helps Notre Dame getting into the college football playoff more than it hurts Notre Dame, because I think they would jump them. So that'd be another team they would jump. I think Michigan State's probably going to lose another football game, probably to Ohio State of all of the teams that they play. I think Michigan's going to lose another game, whether it's to Penn State or Ohio State. They might lose two more. And then I think Ohio State has shown that they're pretty vulnerable to losing some games here and there as well. So, I mean, maybe they lose to Wisconsin or something like that in the Big Ten championship game. They've struggled with Wisconsin in the past, and Wisconsin's starting to show that they're maybe a better football team as well, which I think is going to help Notre Dame's resume down the road. And I think really the one team there that I haven't mentioned is Oklahoma. And, we've seen Oklahoma lose games in the past. I think they're really good right now with Caleb Williams. But maybe Oklahoma is sort of the Cincinnati in this scenario where everything else goes wrong, but then Oklahoma and Notre Dame are able to sneak in. And again, like I said, I'm just kind of spitballing. I'm not saying that Notre Dame's going to do it. Again, I would predict that they don't make the college football playoff. And if I were to choose today, I'd probably, I didn't even mention Oregon. I guess if Oregon goes goes undefeated the rest of the way in this scenario, they would stay in this kind of scenario as well. So there's just a lot of things, but Oregon has obviously shown that they're susceptible to losing. I mean, losing to Stanford, who looks pretty awful right now, shows that Oregon can certainly lose to some teams also. So I know I'm kind of babbling on about it, and I mentioned I don't think Notre Dame would sneak in, but there's always hope. And we'll get to this comment real quick by Chip Filer. And then we'll get going. And I'm not saying I disagree with him. Ben, I'll let you kind of touch on this as well, obviously. But my thoughts overall is that Notre Dame beat themselves in that game. I think we talked about this after that game ended and in the weeks after. I do think Cincinnati dominated to a certain extent. But I think when you really turn on that tape, you saw a Notre Dame program that was not playing to their caliber that they've been playing over the last few weeks. They weren't playing the up-tempo offense that they've shown that they're pretty good at. Buckner wasn't really involved in the offensive scheme at that point either, which I think is a big deal. And obviously, certainly if Kyle Hamilton is healthy, which he was healthy for that game, in due credit to Cincinnati, and actually got beat for a touchdown on that game in that game as well. But overall, I just think Notre Dame is a better football team right now than they were when they played Cincinnati. And I know Chip is kind of mentioning some other things here and there. The biggest thing is I think it was 3-0 on turnover ratio in that game. And to me, that's beating yourselves when you're a program like Notre Dame that does not turn the football over almost ever. At this point, they're one of the better teams in the country over the last several seasons in not turning the football over. You had a kickoff return that was fumbled. That is very rare. Notre Dame very rarely even takes the ball out of the end zone on kickoff returns. And then I forget what the other two.
Jack Cohn had that terrible interception on the first drive of the game where
when they were driving down to go up 7-0, and Jack Cohn just throws the ball right to a defender in the red zone. And you certainly give Cincinnati credit in those situations. I mean, that's where I think this is getting confused, and me saying that Notre Dame beat themselves. I'm not saying that Cincinnati wasn't the better football team that day. I'm saying that it was coupled by the fact that Notre Dame allowed them to be the better football team in that game to a certain extent. And right now, I think Notre Dame is a much better football team than they were 4 or 5 weeks ago when they played Cincinnati.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the direction and what's different about the two teams, I mean, I don't follow Cincinnati football enough to be able to talk about their personnel and that type of stuff, but Cincinnati's not looked good. Notre Dame's looked much better. Notre Dame is playing starting two different offensive linemen now than they were when they played Cincinnati. The offensive line play has improved overall. I mean, I think it was at its peak worst when they were playing Cincinnati, to be honest with you. Jack Cohn took 1 million sacks the first however many weeks of the season. And then, of course, on the first drive of the game against Cincinnati, he decides, well, this is the time where I'm going to try to throw out of it, and threw it right to Cincinnati. I mean, I believe Jonathan Dorr missed a field goal in that game, muffed the kickoff return, like you said. I mean, you're right. I mean, Cincinnati, obviously, yeah. And then obviously Cincinnati, forced, I mean, they blitzed, they forced Jack Cohn into that bad decision. But I mean, if you watch the rest of the tape for the rest of the season, Jack Cohn hasn't made that bad panic throw all year, and then all of a sudden he does against Cincinnati.
Yeah, usually just takes a sack.
Right. And so, and like you said, Buckner was not really a weapon in that particular game. Really wasn't involved all that much. Is now maybe at that point, when Notre Dame was scuffling so bad, maybe they go to Buckner. And if that game's played again, I just tweeted a little bit ago that I would love Notre Dame and Cincinnati to, meet up outside the college football or in the college football playoff. I don't care, but I'd love for them to meet up in January or late December or whatever it is again. Because I do think that overall Notre Dame's the better football team. Cincinnati was benefited from Notre Dame was, I don't know, hadn't figured everything out yet. And I think Cincinnati was more experienced, I guess you could kind of say, in a lot of areas in that game. And honestly, I think if they play 10 times. Notre Dame wins 6 or 7 of them at the very least. So I don't know. I think you're, it's not exactly correct to just say that, Cincinnati wasn't the better football team on that. I mean, that's true. They were the better football team on that day. Notre Dame played terrible, and Cincinnati certainly had a lot to do with that. But I just don't think that most of that stuff happens on a normal Notre Dame home game, especially.
Yeah, I think that's where people get confused sometimes. A team can be the better football team during that game, and the other team can also beat themselves, because beating yourselves makes you not the better football team.
Absolutely.
And again, that's not meant to be an insult. I mean, sometimes being the better football team makes the other team force those mistakes. So in that specific game, yes, I do agree with Chip to an extent here that, I mean, clearly Cincinnati did dominate Notre Dame in certain aspects of that game, but I also think that those are mistakes that can be avoided at this point for Notre Dame. Mm-hmm. And if they were to play again, knowing what they know now, I think those mistakes would be avoided overall. So
Cincinnati took advantage. I'll just sum it up by this: took advantage of Notre Dame weaknesses that are not as much of a weakness at the very least right now. The offensive line, especially. I mean, Notre Dame's offensive line still isn't great, but they're playing far and away better than they played. Whenever that game was there in October.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, guys, we're gonna wrap things up. We've been going on for about 45 minutes, which is actually longer than I thought we were gonna end up going today for Navy. But again, appreciate your guys' comments. I know some of you kind of came in late, and Chip, I do appreciate your comment, even though we disagreed with you a little bit there. But there's nothing wrong with that. But we'll be back next week. Notre Dame takes on Virginia. Don't think that time has actually been announced yet, because ESPN had a hold on it. Or whatever it was. But could be a very good game. I mean, if Brennan Armstrong plays for Virginia, they have a high-powered offense, and I think it could be a similar outcome to the Notre Dame North Carolina game, where both teams are kind of scoring at will to an extent. Because I do think the Notre Dame defense has some flaws right now, but the offense is sort of clicking on all cylinders to an extent. And I think getting healthier, guys like Tyree, Lindsey, hopefully. Another week back from their injuries. Hopefully Avery Davis is good to go. We didn't even touch on that. Looked like he had a pretty nasty knee injury, but he walked off the field. So maybe there's some hope there that even if he misses next week's game, that it's not, a season-ending thing or something like that. But again, guys, thanks for tuning in. Again, I'm Nathan Urbach. I'm one of your hosts here for the Postgame show at the Voice of College Football. I'm here most weeks with Ben Belden from the Under the Dome podcast. And again, we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for joining.